All right, last little video clip here will be about some really strange infectious agents, and they're called prions. And probably the most famous example of a prion disease is one we've all heard about, and it's mad cow disease. And there's a similar disease in sheep called scrapie that is caused by prions. All of these are types of something called a spongiform encephalopathy. So encephalitis, that's inflammation of the brain, basically. Spongiform is referring to brain tissue being converted into spongy-like tissue. So if you look over here, this is a slice of tissue from the brain of, it's been so long since I put this image in here, I don't know if this is from a cow or a sheep or a human who might have this type of infection, but the pink areas on here from the brain are living tissue that picked up a pink dye, and all those white areas that you see there are holes in that brain tissue where you used to have neurons, and those neurons have died, and so now you just have space there. Neurons don't get replaced in the brain very efficiently, so when they're dead and they're gone. You wind up with holes where they used to exist. So I called a prion an infectious agent. It's not a virus, it's not a bacterium, it's not a living thing at all. And it has, the weirdest thing about these is they have no DNA or RNA, there's no genome. They are simply an infectious protein. Very strange. When these were first described, the scientist back in the 1980s, who was originally promoting this idea that there were prion diseases, people didn't believe him at first. They just thought, well, you're probably just missing the RNA or DNA genome, because how could a protein replicate itself? It's an infectious disease-causing agent, so it must be replicating. How can that happen if you don't have an RNA or a DNA genome? So people didn't believe it at first when these were first described. It turns out that these prions that are infectious proteins, they're actually mutant forms of a normal cellular protein in the neurons in the central nervous system. The natural function of that protein, they sit in the membranes of our neurons. Not really well understood what those proteins do. Prions are a misfolded version of that protein that is actually able to function like an enzyme, and it can take other copies of that protein, the normal version, and mutate them, convert them over to the nasty prion version, which is very bizarre. This can develop, these spongiform encephalopathies can develop spontaneously due to a genetic mutation, because it's a protein and there is a mutation that's associated with that, an amino acid chain. So that can develop spontaneously just due to a genetic mutation in a neuron in the brain. Or once that's happened, those mutated proteins can spread. They start finding other versions of themselves that are normal and converting them over to the prion nasty version. And then if they spread to a new host, that new host that can become infected with these as well. Okay, so this is what they're showing you here. This is actually a diagram from a news article. So here's a neuron, a nerve cell. The little green specks you see there, those are supposed to represent the normal prion proteins, which is designated as PRP. So that has some sort of normal function for the neurons. That's still not well understood. In orange here, though, you've got the mutated version. And the mutated version doesn't do what it's supposed to do. It doesn't sit up here in the cell surface performing some kind of function. Instead, it accumulates inside the neuron and winds up taking lots of space in there, and eventually it will kill the neuron. In addition, those prion forms, the evil forms of the protein, can spread to other neurons and start converting these normal green types you see there into the bad orange types, and then they'll start accumulating inside the neurons. They build up over time and eventually kill those neuron cells. And so as you lose more and more of your neurons, that's when you start to lose your brain function. That's why cows start to appear like they're going mad, and that's where the name mad cow disease came from, because the cows look like they're going crazy because their neurons are being killed due to this prion type illness. Here's another way of looking at this. So you've got the normal version of this protein. When you have the mutant form around, it's misfolded, and unfortunately this misfolded mutated version, where there's an amino acid change, is able to act as an enzyme and convert other versions of the normal one into the mutated form. And the problem is, like, if you eat beef that's contaminated with these prion proteins, they can also do the same thing in our brains. We have these same proteins sitting in the membranes of our neurons, so these prion forms can come into our brains and start converting our normal proteins over to this nasty prion form, and then that can kill our neurons, and you can wind up with dementia and other types of problems associated with this illness. All right, so just wanted to kind of hit some highlights there on prions. Maybe we'll have some questions in class about prion type illnesses. If you do have any, be sure to bring those up on Wednesday so we can talk about them a little bit further. They're very bizarre. One of the things that's not all that that wasn't understood at first was, well, how do these things even get to the brain? I mean, if you eat hamburger, prions or proteins, well, proteins usually get digested in your digestive system. They get chopped into amino acids. So how in the world do they ever wind up in your brain? Well, it turns out these prions get taken up by cells called dendritic cells that are sitting in the, you may remember those from Biology 201. You learn about a little bit about those when you study the skin. You also have those along your intestinal lining, and they can take up those prion proteins, and then they wind up migrating to the central nervous system and releasing those prion proteins in the brain. I saw an article about that not too long ago. So we're starting to learn more and more about how these actually work, and how you can actually have a protein with no RNA or DNA that by itself can actually multiply, create others, almost kind of like a zombie, and winds up causing a pretty nasty infectious disease. There is, some people develop a spontaneous version of this due to a mutation in a neuron in their brain, for a mutation in the gene that codes for this prion protein, the normal form, and that's called Creutzfeldt-Jakob syndrome, CJV or something like that. I have to look at it. It's been a while since I've seen how it's spelled, but that's the spontaneous version that can happen in some people. All right, so that concludes the video lectures as a substitute for our Monday of class. So when we return to class, we will have another genetics activity that we'll do, and also please bring any questions that you may have on these topics so we can review those before we start moving on to the immunology part of the class.